He had arranged a leave of absence from the office in order to accommodate the metabolic series. Kirk Penchley had been almost indecently willing to accommodate his request, leaving Halleck with a truth he would just as soon not have faced. They wanted to get rid of him. Now he called Penchley back from the payphone at Barker's coffee shop and told him he might have to take more than 3 days. How much time?" Penchley asked him. "I don't know for sure," Halleck said. 2 weeks maybe, possibly a month. "No problem, Bill. We'll want to turn the Hood matter over to Ron Baker, but I think everything else can hang fire for a while longer." A thoughtful silence at Kirk Penchley's end. Then, "Well, if there's anything I can do—" "There is something," Billy said. "You remember my trouble this early spring, the accident?" "Yes." "The woman I struck was a gypsy. Did you know that?" "It was in the paper," Penchley said reluctantly. "She was part of a band, I guess you'd say. A band of gypsies. They were camping out here in Fairview. Her name was Susanna Lemke." Lempke? No P. Okay. "After the accident, the gypsies found they'd worn out their welcome in Fairview. Now, I've got reason to believe they went to Raintree. I want to know if you can trace them from there. I want to know where they are now. I'll pay the fees out of my own pocket." "Damned right you will," Penchley said jovially. "We'll do our best. I'll get the McBarton agency onto the job." "Thank you, Kirk," Halleck said. "Oh, don't mention it," Penchley said. "You just work on getting better." He was really not very surprised to find that Rand Foxworth, the assistant chief, was running things down at the Fairview police station. "Dunk's had a touch of the flu," he said in answer to Billy's question. "He hasn't been in for the last couple of days." "Oh," Billy said. "The flu." "That's right," Foxworth said. Hopley had a trim New England salt box on Ribbonmaker Lane. Billy parked in the driveway at dusk, went to the door, and rang the bell. There was no answer. He rang again, no answer. He went to the garage, cupped his hands around his face, and peered in. Hopley's car, a conservative cordovan-colored Volvo, was parked in there. Hopley was a bachelor. Billy went back to the door and began hammering on it. He hammered for nearly 3 minutes, and his arm was getting tired when a hoarse voice yelled, "Go away!" "Let me in," Billy shouted back. "I have to talk to you." There was no answer. After a minute, Billy began to hammer again. There was no response at all this time. But when he stopped suddenly, he heard a whisper of movement on the other side of the door. "Hopley, I think you're there," he said quietly. "You don't have to say anything, just listen to me. It's Billy Halleck. 2 months ago I was involved in an accident. There was an old gypsy woman who was jaywalking." Movement behind the door, definite now, a shuffle rustle. "I hit her and I killed her. Now I'm losing weight. I'm not on a diet or anything like that. I'm just losing weight. About 75 pounds so far. And if it doesn't stop soon, I'm going to look like the human skeleton in a carny sideshow." Judge Rossington presided at the preliminary hearing and declared that there was no case. "He's developed some weird skin disease." Billy thought he heard a low gasp of surprise. "And he's gone out to the Mayo Clinic. The doctors have told him it isn't cancer, but they don't know what it is. Rossington would rather believe it is cancer than what he knows it really is." Billy swallowed. There was a painful click in his throat. "It's a gypsy curse, Hopley. I know how crazy that sounds, but it's the truth. There was an old man. He touched me when I came out of the hearing. He touched Rossington when he and his wife were at a flea market in Raintree. Did he touch you, Hopley?" There was a long, long silence. And then one word drifted to Billy's ears through the mail slot, like a letter full of bad news from home. "Yes." "When? Where?" No answer. "I have to talk to you," Billy said desperately. No answer. Billy waited, hunting inside himself for more words, other arguments. He could find none. Hopley simply wasn't going to let him in. He had begun to turn away when the door clicked open. He saw a dim shape at the far end of the hall. A door on the left opened. The shape went in. A dim light glowed, and for a moment a shadow stretched long and gaunt across the hall floor. Billy walked down the hall. He stood outside the open door for a moment. It looked like a study or a den, but the light was so faint it was impossible to tell for sure. "Hopley?" "Come in," the papery voice whispered. Billy did. There was a blonde wood desk in the center. A tensor lamp stood on it. Hopley had bent the lamp's neck so that the shade was less than an inch from the desk blotter. There was a small and savagely concentrated circle of light on the blotter. The rest of the room was a cold land of shadows. Hopley himself was a manlike bulk in what might have been an Ames chair. Billy stepped over the threshold. There was a chair in the corner. Billy sat in it. When did he began. Touch me? Just about 5 weeks ago, if it matters. I went up to Milford to see my mother and father. I took them out to lunch. I had a few beers before and a few more during the meal and decided to use the men's room before we left. The door was locked. I waited. It opened and he came out. Old geezer with a rotted nose. He touched my cheek and said something. What? I didn't hear it, Hopley said, but I knew what it meant. Now, all I've got to do is look in the mirror. Slowly, his hand crept into the narrow circle of light thrown by the tensor lamp and turned it so that it shone on his face. Halleck dimly heard a gasp and realized it had come from him. Hopley's skin was a harsh alien landscape. Malignant red pimples the size of tea saucers grew out of his chin, his neck, his arms, the back of his hands. Smaller eruptions rashed in his cheeks and forehead. His nose was a plague zone of blackheads. Yellowish pus oozed and flowed in weird channels between bulging dunes of proud flesh. Blood trickled here and there. Coarse black hairs, beard hairs, grew in crazy helter-skelter tufts, and Halleck's horrified, overburdened mind realized that shaving would have become impossible some time ago in the face of such cataclysmic upheavals. From the center of it all, helplessly embedded in that trickling red landscape, were Hopley's staring eyes. They looked at Billy Halleck for what seemed an endless length of time, reading his revulsion and dumbstruck horror. At last he nodded, as if satisfied, and turned the tensor lamp off. "Oh, Christ, Hopley, I'm sorry." "Don't be," Hopley said. "Yours is going slower, but you'll get there eventually. My service pistol is in the third drawer of this desk, and when it gets bad enough, I'll use it, no matter what. God hates a coward, my father used to say. I wanted you to see me so you'll understand." He thought of calling Ginelli at Three Brothers. Ginelli seemed like an answer of some kind, just what kind he didn't know. But in the end, he went ahead and checked into the Glassman Clinic and began the metabolic series. It was, after all, a place to be, and while he was there, Kirk Penchley and the McBarton Detective Services would be taking care of his business, he hoped. So he was poked and prodded. He drank a horrid, chalky-tasting barium solution. He was given X-rays, a CAT scan, an EEG, and EKG, and a total metabolic survey. On the third day, he met with the 3 doctors in charge of his case. The upshot was that they wanted him to hang in at Glassman for another week or 2, possibly 3. They were going to whip what was wrong with him. They contemplated a series of megavitamins to start with, plus protein injections and many more tests. "No," Billy said. "Please understand that it's not even an option." One of them put his fingers gently to his temples as if he had just developed a splitting headache. "What can we say to convince you, Mr. Halleck?" "Nothing," Billy replied. "But why? Why, Mr. Halleck?" "Because," Billy said, "although you think you can help me, gentlemen, you can't." And looking at their unbelieving, uncomprehending faces, Billy thought he had never felt so lonely in his life. Linda was gone. Heidi had sent her to her Aunt Rhoda's in Westchester County. "I did it for a couple of reasons," Heidi said. "The first is that she needs a rest from you, Billy, from what's happening to you. She's half out of her mind. It's gotten so I can't convince her you don't have cancer." He felt that bright hate surface in his heart again. Mommy had driven his daughter off to Auntie's house as soon as Billy had called and said he was on his way. And how come? Why, because the boogie daddy was coming home. "Don't run screaming, dear. It's only the thin man." "Billy, are you all right?" Heidi's voice was oddly hesitant. "I'm as all right as I can be, I guess. Why?" "Because you looked strange. For a minute." Heidi turned away and stubbed her cigarette out in a crystal ashtray. "The second thing is, you've been keeping something from me, Billy, something to do with this. Now I want to know. I deserve to know." She was beginning to cry. "You want to know?" Halleck asked. "You really want to know?" He felt a strange, dry grin surface on his face. "Yes, yes." So Billy told her everything. Houston called him the following day, and after a long and meaningless prologue, he got to the point. Heidi was with him. He and Heidi had had a long chat. The upshot was simply this: they thought Billy was just as crazy as a loon. "Mike," Billy said, "the old gypsy was real. He touched all three of us. Me, Carrie Rossington, Duncan Hopley. Now, for Christ's sake, before you decide I've gone crazy, at least consider the logical link." "Billy, there is no link." Billy began. "I've talked to Lita Rossington. She says Carrie is in the Mayo being treated for skin cancer. She says it's gone pretty far, but they're reasonably sure he's going to be okay. She further says she hasn't seen you since the Gordons' Christmas party." "She's lying." There was a long silence from Houston's end. "Talk to Duncan Hopley. He'll confirm." "I can't, Billy. Duncan Hopley committed suicide 2 days ago. He did it while you were in the Glassman clinic. Shot himself with his service pistol." Halleck closed his eyes tightly and swayed on his feet. "Then you know," he said with his eyes still closed. "You know, or someone knows. Someone saw him." "Grand Lawler saw him," Houston said. "I called him just a few minutes ago." Grand Lawler was the county coroner. "What did he say?" "That Hopley's complexion was a mess, but nothing like the horror show you described to Heidi. Grand's description leads me to believe that it was a nasty outbreak of an adult acne I'd treated Duncan for off and on ever since I first examined him back in 1974. The outbreaks depressed him quite badly." "You think he got depressed over the way he looked and killed himself?" "In essence, yes." Let me get this straight," Billy said. "You believe this was a more or less ordinary outbreak of the adult acne he had had for years, but at the same time you believe he killed himself because of what he was seeing in the mirror. Now, that's a weird diagnosis, Mike." "Now listen," Houston said. "There are no such things as gypsy curses. Billy, if there's a curse on you, it's been laid by your own subconscious mind. Old gypsies can't lay curses, but your own mind, masquerading as an old gypsy, can." "Me, Hopley, and Rossington," Halleck said dully, "all at the same time. You're the one who's blind, Mike. Add it up." When Heidi came home, she looked at him with accusing eyes, and they found that they had absolutely nothing to say to each other. So it was for the rest of the week, at the end of which Halleck was down to 156 pounds. On Friday, Houston called again. "I want you to listen to me very carefully, Billy. This is important." Heidi and Houston had had another long consultation. Houston had then held a long consultation with the Glassman clinic. They all thought that Billy would perhaps profit from a battery of psychiatric tests. "I want to urge you most strongly to take these of your own free will," Houston finished. "If I say no?" "Heidi has legal recourse," Houston said carefully. "You understand?" "I understand," Billy said. "You're talking about you and Heidi and the three stooges there at the Glassman clinic getting together and committing me." "That's pretty melodramatic, Billy." "Goodbye, Mike," Halleck said, and hung up softly. Halleck was not seriously worried about being hauled away to the funny farm. Such procedures took time. But the final conversation with Houston showed him clearly just how far things had gone and how impossible it was that anyone was going to believe him then or ever. He called a New York number, paging to the back of his address book to find it. "Three brothers," the voice on the other end said. My name is William Halleck, and I would like to speak to Mr. Gianelli if he's available." "William!" It occurred to Billy again that Gianelli was the only person in the world who called him that. "How you doing, paisan?" "I've lost some weight." "Well, you come on into the Brothers, William. I'm going to fix you my own special, chicken Neapolitan. It'll put all that weight back on you in one meal." I might just take you up on that, Billy said, smiling a little. Ginelli's voice dropped a notch. I heard you had some trouble out there in Connecticut, he said. He made Connecticut sound as if it was someplace in Greenland, Billy thought. How did you hear that? Billy said, frankly startled. There had been a squib about the accident in the Fairview Reporter, and that was all, nothing in the New York papers. I keep my ear to the ground, Ginelli replied. I have some problems with that, Billy said now, picking his words carefully. The woman, you know about the woman. Yeah, I heard she was a gypsy, yes. She had a husband. He has made some trouble for me. Is this guy trying to hit on you? Billy hesitated. I'd as soon not say too much right now, Richard. It's pretty peculiar, but yeah, he's hitting on me. He's hitting on me pretty hard. Well, shit, William, we ought to talk now. The concern in Ginelli's voice was clear and immediate. I appreciate that, I really do, but I want to try to handle it myself first. I'm not even entirely sure what I'd want you to do. If you want to call, William, I'm around. Okay? That evening, Penchley called. Your gypsies have led us a merry chase, he said. Tell me what you've got, Billy said. His hands were sweating. The gypsy band had first gone to Greenough, the Connecticut city about 30 miles north of Milford. A week after they had been rousted from Greenough, they turned up in Pawtucket, near Providence, Rhode Island. After Pawtucket, Attleboro, Massachusetts. Penchley paused for breath. Give me the rest, please, Billy snapped. There wasn't much more. The gypsies had shown up in Revere, just north of Boston, had stayed 10 days and moved on of their own accord. 4 days in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and then they had simply dropped out of sight. We can pick up their scent again if you want, Penchley said. We're less than a week behind now. There are 3 first-class investigators from the McBarton Detective Services on this, and they think the gypsies are almost certainly somewhere in Maine by now, on the coast. Is there an old man with them? Billy asked. He was gripping the phone very tightly. About 80, with a horrible nose condition, sore, cancer, something like that. Tadeusz Lemke, Penchley said calmly. The father of the woman you struck with your car. Yes, he's with them. Father, Halleck barked. That's impossible, Kirk. The woman was old, around 70, 75. Tadeusz Lemke is 106. His daughter. Lemke's daughter. In Billy's mind, it seemed to change everything. Suppose someone had struck Linda. Suppose it had been Linda run down in the street like a mongrel dog. Are you sure you don't want us to close this down? It's costing you, Bill, said Penchley. Please ask them to push on a little further, Billy said. I'll call you in 4 days, no, 3, and find out if you've located them. You don't need to do that, Penchley said. When the McBarton people locate them, you'll be the first to know. I won't be here, Halleck said slowly. Oh? Penchley's voice was carefully noncommittal. Where do you expect to be? Traveling, Halleck said. Heidi went out the next day just after 10 to do some shopping. She did not look in on Billy to tell him where she was going or when she would be back. That old and amiable habit was no more. After the Olds had disappeared down the street, Billy ran a piece of paper into his Olivetti and wrote, Dear Heidi, at the top. It was the only part of the letter that came easily. He wrote it one painful sentence at a time, always thinking in the back of his mind that she would come back in while he was pecking it out, but she did not. He put the letter in an envelope with Heidi's name scrawled across the front and propped it against the Lazy Susan on the kitchen table. Then he called a cab to take him to the Hertz office in Westport. He stopped that night in Providence. He called the office, got the answering service, and left a message for Kirk Penchley. Would he please send all available photographs of the gypsies and all available particulars on their vehicles, including license plate numbers and VIN numbers, to the Sheraton Hotel in South Portland, Maine? The service read the message back correctly, a minor miracle in Billy's opinion, and he turned in. He slept dreamlessly for the first time in weeks. He discovered the following morning that there were no scales in the motel bathroom. Thank God, Billy Halleck thought, for small favors. He dressed quickly, stopping only once as he was tying his shoes, perfectly amazed to hear himself whistling. He was headed up the interstate again by 8:30 and was checked into a Sheraton across from a huge shopping mall by 6:30. A message from Penchley was waiting for him. Information on its way, but difficult. May take a day or two. Although he had been ravenous earlier, he found he could only pick at his dinner. He slept badly and rose early. He did not whistle as he dressed. He decided Kirk Penchley and the investigators from McBarton were right. The gypsies would stick to the seacoast. The tourists were along the seacoast, and so were the dollars they were so anxious to roll out of their wallets. That's where the gypsies would be, but where exactly? In his room, Billy listed better than 50 seacoast towns and then went downstairs. The bartender was an import from New Jersey, but Billy found a waitress who had lived in Maine all her life. I'm looking for some people, and I'm fairly sure they'll be in a seacoast town, but not a really ritzy one. More of a honky-tonk kind of town? She asked. Billy nodded. She bent over his list. Old Orchard Beach, she said. That's the honkiest honky-tonk in them all. Apart from Bar Harbor, she corrected herself. Bar Harbor's crazy. I used to go up there sometimes in July or August and hang out, but not anymore. I'm too old for that now. Billy's smile became wistful. The waitress looked all of 23. You mind a little piece of advice, mister? Not at all, Billy answered. You ought to fatten yourself up a little, she said. Eat pasta. Put on a few pounds. A manila envelope full of photographs and automobile information arrived for Halleck on his third day in South Portland. He shuffled through the photographs slowly, looking at each. Here was the young man who had been juggling his pins. His name was also Lemke, Samuel Lemke. Here was the pretty young girl. Her name was Angelina Lemke. He put her picture next to the picture of Samuel Lemke, brother and sister. The grandchildren of Susanna Lemke, he wondered? The great-grandchildren of Tadeusz Lemke? Here was the elderly man who had been handing out flyers. Richard Crosskill. Other Crosskills were named. Stanchfields, Starbirds, more Lemkes, and then, near the bottom, it was him. A kerchief was drawn over his head and knotted beside the left cheek. A cigarette was tucked into the deeply cracked lips. The nose was a wet and open horror, festering and terrible. The eyes, caught in twin nets of wrinkles, were dark and level and filled with clear intelligence. In those eyes, Billy saw a deep knowledge that made all the 20th century a shadow, and he trembled. That night, when he stepped on the scales in the bathroom adjoining his bedroom, he was down to 137. Billy turned his rental car toward Old Orchard Beach, which was about 18 miles south, and drove. Traffic slowed to a bumper-to-bumper crawl still a mile from the beach. Most of the people Billy saw, both in the crawling traffic and walking along the sides of the road, seemed dressed in the least the law would allow, and sometimes less. He parked his car in a baking macadam lot, paid the attendant $17 for a half-day stub, transferred his wallet from his hip pocket to the inside pocket of his sport coat, and started hunting. There was a bar up ahead called the Seven Seas. There were 2 signs taped to the door. Icy Cool read one. Terminal Happy Hour read the other. Billy went in. Help you? The bartender asked, coming over. I'd like a schooner, please. Okay. The beer came. Billy drank it slowly. The bartender returned. Hit you again? Please, and I'd like a word with you if you have time. About what? Some people who might have been through here. Where's here? The seas? Old Orchard. The bartender laughed. So far as I can see, everyone in Maine comes through here in the summer. These were gypsies. Oh, you must mean those guys who were camped out by the salt shack. Billy's heart speeded in his chest. Can I show you some pictures? Wouldn't do any good. I didn't see 'em. He called. Lonnie, come over here a minute. One of the old men who had been sitting by the window got up and shuffled over to the bar. He was wearing gray cotton pants, a white shirt that was too big for him, and a snap-brimmed straw hat. His face was weary. This is Lon Enders, the bartender said. He's got a little place just on the west of town, same side the salt shack's on. Lon sees everything that goes on in Old Orchard. I'm Bill Halleck. Meet you, Lon Enders said in a papery voice, and took the stool next to Billy's. Halleck explained again while Ender's tired, too-shiny face looked dreamily off into the shadows of the 7 seas. They was here, he said when Billy had finished. They was here, all right. I hadn't seen any gypsies in 7 years or more. Hadn't seen this bunch in maybe 20 years. Billy took his envelope of photographs from his sport coat pocket and laid them out carefully like a pat poker hand. Gina Lemke, Samuel Lemke, Richard Crosskill, Maura Starbird, Tadeusz Lemke. Ah! The old man on the stool breathed in sharply when Billy put the last one down. And he hasn't aged a day since I first seen him and his friends here in the summer of 1963. Enders finished his beer and went on. They set up camp behind Herc's Salt Shack Lobster Barn on Route 27. They stayed 4 days and 4 nights. Now, I guess they would have stayed longer, but I heard they arranged a dogfight for some rich Canucks and the state cops got wind of it. Dogfight? People want to bet, my friend, and Drift Trade is always willing to arrange the things they want to bet on. That's one of the things Drift Trade is for. Dogs or roosters with steel spurs, maybe even 2 men with these itty-bitty sharp knives that look almost like spikes, and each of 'em bites the end of a scarf, and then the one who drops his end first is the loser. What the gypsies call a fair one. Where did they head for? Billy asked. Don't know, Enders said at once. Gypsies don't leave forwarding addresses, my friend. Billy's shoulders slumped. But I was up when they pulled out the next morning. I don't sleep worth a shit anymore, and most of their vans and cars didn't have much in the way of mufflers. I seen 'em go out Highway 27 and turn north onto Route 1. My guess would be Rockland. Billy Halleck had no trouble at all following the gypsies up the coast. It was the way the cars and vans traveled together, almost bumper to bumper, the colorful pictures on the sides, the gypsies themselves. On June 4, they had camped in Boothbay Harbor, not on the seacoast itself, but they had found a farmer willing to rent them a hayfield in the Kenniston Hill area for $20 a night. The farmer's name was Washburn. Billy spoke to Washburn on the 21st, and the gypsies had rolled out of Boothbay Harbor, heading north on the morning of the 8th. 13 days behind now. On the evening of the 23rd, he called Kirk Penchley, hoping for fresh information, and when Kirk came on the line, there was a funny double click just at the moment Kirk asked, How are you, Billy boy, and where are you? Billy hung up quickly, sweating. He suddenly decided he was going to move on, even if it meant he ended up spending the night sleeping in the car. He hadn't cared for that double click at all. You sometimes heard that sound when the wire was being tapped or when traceback equipment was being used. Heidi's signed the committal papers on you, Billy. She signed them and Houston co-signed them. Penchley's turned against you. Get out of here, Billy. It turned out to be the best thing that he could have done. As he was checking into the Bangor Ramada Inn that morning at 2 o'clock, he showed the desk clerk the pictures. It had become a habit by now, and the clerk nodded at once. Where were they? Or are they still? Nah, they're not there anymore. Parsons is where they were, but they're gone all right. I was there by the other day. Is it a farmer's place? No, it's where Parsons' bargain barn used to be until it burned down last year. Billy found Parsons' bargain barn the following morning. It was a scorched cinder block shell in the middle of what seemed to be 9 acres of deserted parking lot. There was a realtor's sign. Billy took his notebook from his back pocket and jotted down the information on it. The realtor's name was Frank Quigley, but he insisted that Billy call him Biff. There were framed pictures of a high school-age Biff Quigley on the walls. Yes, Biff said, he had rented the space to the gypsies. They had arrived on the 10th and stayed 3 days. At noon on the 13th, he had driven to the site. He was in time to see the gypsy caravan pulling out. They're headed for the Chamberlain Bridge, he said, and that's all I know. It was the 24th of June. The gypsies had left Bangor via the Chamberlain Bridge on the 13th. Now he was only 11 days behind, closer. The gypsies had driven the 44 miles to Ellsworth on the 13th and had been granted a permit to camp on the fairground for 3 days. Then they had crossed the Penobscot River to Bugsport, where they had stayed another 3 days before moving on toward Bar Harbor. Billy discovered all of this on the 25th. The gypsies had left Bucksport late on the afternoon of June 19th. Now he was only a week behind them. Bar Harbor was as crazily booming as the waitress had told him it would be. I used to go up there sometimes, she said, in July or August, but not anymore. I'm too old for that now. Me too, Billy thought, sitting on a park bench in cotton pants, a T-shirt, and a sport coat that hung straight down from the bony rack of his shoulders. He was eating an ice cream cone. He was tired. He was alarmed to find out that he was always tired now. He got up, tossed the remainder of his cone into a trash barrel, and walked back to the ice cream vendor. He took out the packet of photographs. It was now rumpled and sweat-stained. He dealt out the familiar tarot hand of images, lining them up along the counter of the man's booth. The vendor looked at them, and Billy immediately saw the recognition in the man's eyes. "This guy," the ice cream vendor said, staring at the photograph of Tadeusz Lemke. "This guy. What a spook." "Are they still around?" "Yeah," the ice cream vendor said. "Yeah, I think they are. The cops kicked them out of town the second day, but they were able to rent a field from a farmer in Technor. That's one town inland from here. I've seen them around." "Thank you." He began to collect his pictures again. "You want another ice cream?" That night, at 9:15, Billy parked his rental car on the soft shoulder of Route 37A, which leaves Bar Harbor to the northwest. He was on top of a hill, and a sea breeze blew around him, ruffling his hair and making his loose clothes flap on his body. Below him to the right, he could see a large campfire surrounded by cars and trucks and vans. Closer in were the people. Every now and then one of them strolled in front of the fire, a black cardboard cutout. He could hear conversation, occasional laughter. He had caught up. Billy looked back at the car for a moment, then shook his head. He started down the grassy side of the hill toward the fire. He paused in back of the camper with the unicorn and the maiden on the side. "I can't go out there," his mind insisted with utter certainty. There was fear in this certainty, but also intertwined in it were inarticulate feelings of shame. He, after all, was the offender. He was... Then Linda's face rose up in his mind. He heard her asking him to come home and beginning to cry as she did. He walked between the camper and the station wagon and into their midst. There was a circle of men and women sitting around the fire, which burned in a dug hollow surrounded by a circle of stones. Billy Halleck stood in the midst of them, totally out of place in his baggy sport coat and city shoes. He looked around. All conversation had ceased. They regarded him with their dark gypsy eyes, and no one said a word. Approaching footsteps and a young woman's voice speaking rapidly and angrily. "Vadsahan, snala dibuk, damig mama." Tadeusz Lemke, dressed in a nightshirt which fell to his bony knees, stepped barefoot into the light of the campfire. Next to him, wearing a cotton nightgown that rounded sweetly against her hips as she walked, was Gina Lemke. "Damig mama, damig." She caught sight of Billy standing in the center of the circle, his sport coat hanging, the seat of his pants bagging to almost below the coat's hem. She flung a hand up in his direction and then turned back to the old man. "Sahon lach, Gina," the old man replied. His face and voice were both serene. One of his twisted hands stroked the smooth black flood of her hair, which fell to her waist. So far, Tadeusz Lemke had not looked at Billy at all. "Viskastana." The girl turned to Billy. "You don't understand our lingo, mister," she screamed at him. "I say to my old papa that you killed my old mama. I say you are a demon and we should kill you." The old man's serene expression did not change. He watched Gina approach Billy as an indulgent parent watches a wayward child. She spat on him, an enormous amount of warm white spittle, as if her mouth had been full of it. Billy could taste some of it on his lips. "You are a murdering bastard," she said, and walked back the way she had come. The old man turned to watch her go, and then at last he turned his gaze on Billy Halleck. Lemke crooked a finger, and as if in a dream, Billy walked slowly around the campfire to where the old man stood in his dark gray nightshirt. "Do you know Rom?" Lemke asked when Billy stood directly in front of him. Billy shook his head. "In Rom, we call you Skomada Iginom, which means white man from town." He grinned, showing rotted, tobacco-stained teeth. "Go now, white man from town. You have no business with us, and we have no business with you. If we had business, it is done. Go back to your town." He began to turn away. "Perhaps you'd wait just a minute while I write down my daughter's address," Billy said, raising his voice. "She's not as lovely as your Gina, but we think she's very pretty. Perhaps they could correspond on the subject of injustice. What do you think, Lemke? Will they be able to talk about that after I'm as dead as your daughter? Who is able to finally sort out where an injustice really lay? If they can't figure this mess out, maybe they can get together someday and shoot each other, and then their kids can give it a try. What do you think, old man? Does that make any more sense than this shit? Lemke walked slowly back to where Billy stood, eyes filled with tears of fury. "You run my daughter over in the road, white man," he said. "Hey, I know who done that. I taken care of it. Mostly we turn and we drive out of town. Mostly, yeah, we do that. But sometimes we get our justice." The old man raised his gnarled hand in front of Billy's eyes. Suddenly it snapped into a closed fist. A moment later, blood began to drip from it. From the others came a mutter, not of fear or surprise, but approval. "Ram justice skumale igenom. The other two I take care of already. The judge, he jumped out window 2 nights ago. He is..." Tadeusz Lemke snapped his fingers and then blew on the ball of his thumb as if it were a seedling dandelion. "Did that bring your daughter back, Mr. Lemke?" Lemke's lips twisted. "Justice ain't bringing the dead back, white man. Justice is justice. I know what you and your woman were up to. You think I don't have the sight? I got the sight. You ask any of them. I got the sight 100 years. There was an assenting murmur from those around the fire. "I don't care how long you've had the sight," Billy said. He reached out deliberately and grasped the old man's shoulders. From somewhere there was a growl of rage. Samuel Lemke started forward. Tadeusz Lemke turned his head and spat a single word in Romany. Billy did not see this. He saw only Lemke. "Fuck your justice," he said. "You know about as much as justice as I know about jet turbines. Take it off me." Lemke's eyes stared up into Billy's. "Let go of me or I'll make it worse," he said calmly. "So much worse you think I blessed you the first time." In a quiet voice, Billy said, "My wife was jerking me off in my big old expensive car, right, and your daughter came out between 2 parked cars in the middle of the block like an ordinary jaywalker, and that's right too. If she had crossed at the corner, she would be alive now. There was fault on both sides. It balances. Not the best balance in the history of the world, maybe, but it balances. They've got a way of saying it in Las Vegas. They call it a push. This is a push, old man. Let it end here." "I never take it off, white man, from town," Tadeusz Lemke said. "I die with it in my mouth." Lemke looked at him for a moment longer. Then suddenly he turned his head. "Enkel da blaka na kanskal skade. Just that." Samuel Lemke and another young man tore Billy away from Tadeusz Lemke. They began to drag him back across the circle. Tadeusz Lemke stood watching, his hands on his hips, and his face a stone mask. "Before they take me away, old man, you ought to know my own curse will fall on your family," Billy called, and his voice was strong, calm, almost cheerful. "The curse of white men from town." The 2 young men stopped pulling him for a moment. Samuel Lemke uttered a short, bewildered laugh. Tadeusz Lemke, however, was not laughing.